When it comes to dangerous men, the mob has produced legends who redefined what it means to rule the underworld. These aren't just criminals, they're architects of chaos, wielding fear as their greatest weapon. From the silent enforcers to the bosses who commanded armies, these figures left a trail of blood and bodies that cemented their infamy. Let's dive into the stories of 5 of the most dangerous mobsters in history, starting with Silvio Tagliagambe, a man whose rise and fall during Prohibition-era New York still sends shivers through Mafia lore. Silvio Tagliagambe's brief and violent life was a testament to the brutality and calculated nature of organized crime during the early 20th century. Born on June 23, 1893 in Finale, Sicily, he arrived in the United States around 1906, settling in Brooklyn's Williamsburg section. By the time of his death in 1922, he had played a significant role in the bloody underworld conflicts that characterized Prohibition-era New York. Tagliagambe was affiliated with the Salvatore D'Aquila crime family, operating out of Brooklyn and the Bronx. His involvement in attempts to wrest control of Manhattan's rackets brought him into direct conflict with Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria. This rivalry culminated in a series of violent confrontations, underscoring the deadly stakes of Mafia power struggles. Early in his criminal career, Tagliagambe became linked to James "Jimmy" Curly Carioggi's Manhattan Gang. This affiliation embroiled him in a feud with a rising racketeer, Antonio Celentano. The conflict erupted into public view in 1913, when Celentano fatally shot Joseph Donato during a gunfight in a saloon near Ken Mare and Mott Streets. Tagliagambe's gang retaliated months later, ambushing Celentano in the Tivoli restaurant on Broome Street. 7 gangsters, including Tagliagambe, entered the establishment, looted patrons, and left Celentano critically injured after a brutal stabbing by Antonio Santini. Though Celentano survived, the episode underscored the gang's ruthlessness. While Santini and other gang members faced convictions for robbery, Tagliagambe's Mafia connections shielded him from significant punishment. His association with Brooklyn bosses provided both protection and advancement opportunities. By the 1920s, he was a key figure within D'Aquila's faction, acting as a link between Brooklyn and Manhattan criminal enterprises. D'Aquila's insecurity as boss of bosses led to widespread violence, particularly after the unexpected releases of former Mafia leaders Giuseppe Morello and Ignazio Lupo. Viewing them as threats, D'Aquila initiated a campaign to eliminate his rivals, including his own enforcer Umberto Valente. This internecine strife only deepened the rift with Masseria's faction. The conflict came to a head on May 8, 1922. That morning, Vincent Terranova, Morello's half-brother, was gunned down in East Harlem. Later that day, a gunfight erupted at Grand and Mulberry Streets in Manhattan. Amid the chaos, bullets tore through the crowded sidewalks, wounding bystanders. Police apprehended Masseria, fleeing the scene, but the violence was far from over. That evening, Silvio Tagliagambe arrived at Bellevue Hospital, gravely wounded from the day's earlier clash. He refused to cooperate with authorities, maintaining the Mafia's code of silence. Despite medical intervention, he succumbed to his injuries on May 9, 1922. His death marked a turning point in the war between D'Aquila and Masseria, with the latter consolidating power shortly thereafter. Masseria faced initial homicide charges for Tagliagambe's death, but was released on bail within months. The conflict's conclusion came swiftly when Valente was assassinated in August 1922, solidifying Masseria's dominance in Manhattan. Tagliagambe's story is one of ambition and allegiance within the Mafia's deadly hierarchy. His rise and fall illustrate the precariousness of power in an era defined by loyalty, betrayal, and relentless violence. Following his death, his widow Francesca and their son moved to Brooklyn, seeking refuge from the turmoil that had claimed Silvio's life. They called him Benny Eggs, but Venero Mangano wasn't the kind of man to crack under pressure. He was the one who applied it, squeezing blood from stone and enemies from existence. As the underboss of the Genovese crime family, Mangano thrived in a world where power was measured by how many men feared you and how many more you could eliminate without breaking a sweat. His hands, clean on the surface, were stained with the work of countless executions, each a brutal testament to his authority. In the world of organized crime, Mangano didn't just survive, he reigned, weaving a legacy of dread so chilling it echoed long after the final shots were fired. In the underbelly of Greenwich Village, the cobblestones were soaked in secrets, and power whispered through its alleyways like a slow-moving tide. This was the cradle of crime for Venero Benny Eggs Mangano, a man whose unassuming nickname masked a ruthlessness that would come to define his legacy. Born during Manhattan's stifling summer of 1921, Benny's life unfolded against a backdrop of quiet cafes, bustling markets, and shadows that stretched long over the lives of its residents. Benny's father, Joseph Mangano, was an immigrant from Lingua Glossa, Sicily, and a man of humble ambitions. He sold eggs from a modest storefront on Thompson Street, where young Benny earned his moniker by handing cartons to housewives while absorbing the street's unspoken rules of power and survival. Life, though simple, seemed straightforward until the cracks began to show. By the time Benny turned 14, the neighborhood had changed. The Genovese crime family, under the watchful eye of Vito Genovese, had entrenched its operations along the West Side docks. Labour racketeering, gambling and smuggling permeated the air of Thompson Street. Benny, wiry and sharp-eyed, began to linger near the docks, observing the burly longshoremen shuffle crates, under orders from men whose polished shoes and cold stares radiated authority. One rainy evening, Benny caught the eye of Salvatore Big Sal Esposito. Sal, impressed by Benny's quick wit and discretion, handed him his first job. A leather satchel, its weight more ominous than its simple appearance, was thrust into Benny's hands with instructions. No stops, straight to the butcher shop on Carmine Street. Benny didn't ask questions, even as the satchel's heft hinted at its contents. The butcher shop's back room, filled with whispers and the clink of tumblers, marked Benny's first step into a world of silent power. The exchange was quick, the tension palpable. He walked away $10 richer, a fortune during the Depression, and with a taste of something far more intoxicating than money. That night, as he lay in bed, the satchel's memory pressed on his chest like an unspoken promise. Benny's success as a courier soon led to deeper involvement. By 16, he was running payroll for dock workers, handling cash that passed through too many hands. One night, as he navigated a narrow alley off Bleecker Street, two men emerged from the shadows, knives glinting in the dim light. They demanded the satchel, but Benny refused. The scuffle was brutal. A blade sliced his forearm and blood streamed down his sleeve. Desperate, Benny swung a loose cobblestone with animalistic ferocity, striking one assailant down. The other fled into the night. Benny staggered to Big Sal's door, dripping blood onto the stoop. Sal, unimpressed by dramatics but respectful of survival, poured whiskey over the wound and sewed it shut with biting thread. "You've got guts, kid," he grunted. "But guts won't save you next time. Learn to see the blade before it's drawn." The lesson stuck. Benny's survival earned him respect, but it also marked him. The streets had tasted his blood, and they would not forget. After the alley incident, Benny's star rose. By 21, he was sitting in clandestine meetings at dimly lit basements and smoke-filled poker rooms. His role was simple: observe, listen, and remember. One such meeting turned volatile when accusations flew over missing shipments. A capo's voice rose above the others, his face red with fury. Seated quietly in the corner, Benny noticed the man's trembling hands and tight grip on a cigar. When the capo stormed out, Benny leaned towards Big Sal and murmured, "He's skimming. Watch how fast he leaves town." Sal laughed, slapping Benny on the back. "You've got the eye, kid, just like your old man picking good eggs." Within a week, the capo had disappeared. Benny never asked what happened, but he knew his observation had sealed the man's fate. It was a turning point, cementing Benny's reputation as a consigliere in training, a man who saw through the noise. With power came darker responsibilities. One cold November night, Benny was ordered to accompany Vinny the Chin Gigante on a message delivery. The target, a rival loan shark who had poached clients. Benny drove while Vinny, brooding and silent, loaded a revolver. The hit was messy. The target stumbled into the street after the first shot, drawing screams from passers-by. Vinny fired twice more, finishing the job. Benny gripped the wheel tightly as they sped away, the wail of sirens receding. That night, Benny lay awake, haunted by the man's lifeless eyes. He realized the cost of loyalty, his conscience, his freedom, his soul. Yet he stayed, bound by golden handcuffs of power and respect. By the 1950s, Benny had ascended to the role of trusted consigliere. He orchestrated labor strikes, rigged union elections, and funneled millions into the family's coffers. His sharp mind and ruthless pragmatism made him indispensable. Yet Benny avoided the flash and hubris that had undone so many others, operating in the shadows with calculated precision. When asked about his success, he would shrug and say, "I'm just a guy who knows a good egg when he sees one." It was a rare moment of levity for a man who had built his life on silence and subtlety, or so it seemed. The Hackensack River was unusually still the morning the fisherman cast his line. Its murky waters mirrored the overcast sky, a dull sheen masking secrets that lay beneath. The mortician's bag bobbed gently against the reeds, its contents sealed, but the story it carried spilling into the ether. By the time the authorities arrived, the stench of death had already begun to seep from the nylon fibres, a putrid harbinger of the violence that had delivered John DiGilio to his watery grave. John DiGilio had always walked a dangerous line, his cocky bravado a razor-thin barrier between triumph and downfall. In Bayonne, New Jersey, his name carried weight, a currency minted in blood and fear. DiGilio's rise was neither subtle nor understated. As he strutted into his trial for extortion conspiracy in 1987, the spectacle he crafted rivaled a Hollywood production. The courtroom transformed into a theatre of defiance. DiGilio, acting as his own defense attorney, turned the proceedings into a platform for his audacious theatrics. Dressed impeccably and flanked by boxing legends like Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, DiGilio radiated confidence. To the press he was magnetic, to prosecutors infuriating. "Bayonne is mine," he boasted in taped conversations played before the jury. His voice dripped with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Yet, even as he mocked his rivals, not Benny Mangano, not anybody, his words sowed the seeds of his undoing. The jury's verdict acquitted DiGilio, a technical victory that left him grinning as he exited the courthouse. But in the shadows, those same taped boasts had reached ears far less forgiving than the courts. Among the Genovese higher-ups, his mockery of underboss Venero Mangano was tantamount to signing his own death warrant. 3 weeks after his courtroom triumph, John DiGilio vanished. His wife Ellen reported him missing on May 7, 1988. "He's never run from anything," his attorney lamented, but the silence from DiGilio's side was deafening. By May 19th, when he failed to appear for sentencing in his loan-sharking conspiracy case, whispers of foul play escalated to a roar. Behind closed doors, the Genovese family had already deliberated on his fate. To them, DiGilio was no longer an asset but a liability, a loose cannon whose antics threatened the family's carefully cultivated facade of invincibility. His arrogance, his court spectacle, and most damningly, his taped derision of Mangano had made him expendable. On May 26th, the Hackensack River offered its verdict. Police officers and forensic experts gathered as the mortician's bag was pulled from the water. When it was unzipped, the grim tableau of DiGilio's final moments was revealed. His head and face had been riddled with bullets, the violence of the act underscoring the rage of his executioners. A credit card had been placed between his legs, an unmistakable signature from his killers. The man who claimed Bayonne now belonged to no one. In the wake of DiGilio's murder, Venero Benny Eggs Mangano rose to fill the vacuum left by his tormentor's theatrics. Mangano, ever the silent operator, embodied the opposite of DiGilio's bombastic style. Where DiGilio flaunted his power, Mangano wielded his with quiet efficiency, stepping into a leadership role when Genovese boss Vincent Gigante underwent heart surgery in the summer of 1988. For a time, Mangano and Gigante shared power, their partnership a study in criminal pragmatism. Federal investigators, however, were not so easily deterred. Evidence mounted, linking the Genovese family to crimes that ranged from money laundering to racketeering. Informants like Peter Blackheart Savino fed the FBI a steady stream of intelligence, their loyalty to the government purchased with promises of leniency. Yet even as law enforcement closed in, Mangano's calculated demeanor preserved the family's structure for now. DiGilio's fate served as a grim warning to others in the underworld, but hubris is an insidious force. As the Genovese family's grip on the East Coast tightened, tensions within their ranks simmered. The cost of maintaining power, both in blood and in secrecy, weighed heavily on those at the top. DiGilio's murder had quelled dissent temporarily, but it also signaled a shift in the Mafia's internal dynamics. The old guard's veneer of invulnerability was cracking. Meanwhile, the FBI's web continued to tighten. High-profile arrests and convictions chipped away at the family's operations. Even Mangano, the consummate underboss, found himself scrutinized. The fateful decision to eliminate DiGilio had been a calculated move, but its ripples extended far beyond the Hackensack River. Each rise to power carried the seeds of its own destruction, and the Genovese family was no exception. The Hackensack River's dark waters flowed on, oblivious to the human dramas that played out along its banks. In the end, Benny lived to see the empire he helped build crumble under federal indictments and internal betrayals. Yet he remained untouched, dying quietly in his Greenwich Village home at 95. The cobblestones that had once run red with his blood now bore the quiet echo of his legacy. A life lived in shadows, where power was as fleeting as the city's restless whispers.
Daniel Danny Sansonese wasn't just a name whispered in Buffalo's underworld. It was a curse spat by rivals and a prayer muttered by the terrified. Born into a Sicilian immigrant family where crime was as inescapable as breath, Danny's life was a symphony of blood and betrayal. His rise through the ranks of the Mafia was painted in the crimson of assassinations and the black ink of extortion records. By the time he cemented his reputation, the city knew Danny not as a man, but as a harbinger of death. A creature who collected debts with cold precision and silenced dissenters with brutal efficiency. His story is one of shattered lives, shattered oaths, and a final, inevitable downfall that proved even monsters can bleed. Daniel Danny Sansonese was born on May 28, 1908, in Buffalo, New York, to Sicilian immigrants Gerardo and Maria Rinaldo Sansonese. His parents, who had arrived in the United States during the 1890s, raised him in a community where opportunity and crime often walked hand in hand. Danny began his descent into criminality at a young age. On December 15, 1921, at just 13 years old, Danny was arrested for grand larceny. Though the charge was reduced to juvenile delinquency, and he was placed on probation with an order to make restitution, this marked his initiation into a life defined by theft and violence. By the time of his arrest in March 1927 for vagrancy, authorities already suspected him of involvement in a string of robberies, as his car matched descriptions from several crime scenes. Despite a lack of evidence to convict, he remained under scrutiny. In May 1927, Danny participated in a morning robbery at a Buffalo drugstore that escalated into a deadly gunfight when police intervened. His accomplice, Dominic DiNapoli, was killed in the shootout, and Danny was critically wounded with a bullet lodged in his back. Arrested at Columbus Hospital, he pleaded guilty to robbery and was sentenced to 7 to 15 years in prison. The injuries left him physically scarred, but mentally hardened. Paroled in November 1932, Danny resumed his criminal activities. By 1935, he and two accomplices, Angelo Polizzi and Joseph Gatti, carried out an armed robbery at a barbershop, taking $114 at gunpoint. The barber's testimony led to convictions for Danny and Polizzi, and as second felony offenders, they were sentenced to 30 years in Attica State Prison. In prison, Danny forged a strong partnership with fellow inmate Joseph Fino, a connection that would serve him well in the years to come. After his parole in December 1944, Danny, along with Fino, became entrenched in gambling and loan sharking operations, asserting influence within Buffalo's criminal underworld. Their activities caught the attention of law enforcement, and in 1950, Danny was arrested again for his involvement in the burglary of an American Legion club in Oxford, New York. Convicted, he served another prison term before being paroled in 1953. By the late 1950s, Danny's reputation had grown darker. As chief enforcer for Federico Randaccio, he was linked to several unsolved murders, including those of Frank and Fred Aquino, Richard Battaglia, and Vincent Santangelo. These killings bore the hallmarks of underworld justice, brutal, efficient, and designed to send a message. Danny's role as an enforcer made him a figure to be both feared and respected, though it kept him firmly in the crosshairs of law enforcement. In the late 1960s, Danny's involvement in the rebellion against Niagara Falls-based boss Stefano Magaddino solidified his power within Buffalo's Mafia. The rebellion fractured Magadino's control, and Danny's loyalty to the insurgents earned him increased authority. When acting boss Sampieri was incarcerated in the early 1970s, Josefino took over and appointed Danny as his underboss. However, the heightened visibility of his position also brought increased scrutiny. In 1972, Danny's criminal empire began to unravel. He was charged with perjury during a grand jury investigation into jury tampering in a gambling case involving Fino. Convicted, he received a 5-year sentence, though his failing health, linked to prostate cancer, resulted in his release after serving 1 year. On November 1, 1975, Danny Sansanese died in Buffalo at the age of 67. His life, marked by violence, betrayal, and a relentless pursuit of power, left a legacy of fear and infamy in Buffalo's underworld. His crimes and their consequences remain a stark reminder of the brutal realities of organized crime.
Benedetto Angelo Palmieri's legacy was built on blood and business. As a mafia underboss, he orchestrated operations that ranged from gambling to bootlegging, each bolstered by a willingness to resort to violence when necessary. Rivals disappeared or were found shot execution style, their deaths serving as stark warnings to others. Palmieri's influence was undeniable, but even the most feared men cannot escape the inevitable. His life ended not in a hail of bullets, but in silence, alone in his car, his empire already beginning to fade. Benedetto Angelo Palmieri's life began in Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, a town where the cobblestone streets and sea breeze concealed countless secrets. Born on January 12, 1878, to Francesco and Anna Calecca Palmieri, Angelo grew up in privilege as the son of a prosperous merchant. Despite his comfortable upbringing, the dark shadows of Sicily's underworld loomed large over his youth. By September 7th, 1906, when Angelo stepped off the SS Lombardia in New York City, he was no mere immigrant seeking fortune. His demeanor hinted at deeper ambitions, shaped by his Sicilian heritage. Initially, he worked as a laborer on the city docks, but his ambitions soon outgrew honest toil. In 1912, he relocated to Buffalo and opened a tavern on Dante Place. Beneath its facade of camaraderie, the tavern housed a thriving gambling operation, preying on those eager to test their luck in a game rigged against them. In August 1912, Buffalo police raided Angelo's gambling den. 11 saloon keepers, including Angelo, were arrested, their images splashed across local headlines as symbols of corruption. Angelo's fine was a mere $50, a small price to pay for a valuable lesson. Trust few, fear none. In 1913, Angelo married Rosaria Mistretta, linking him to Buffalo's burgeoning Mafia. Rosaria was a cousin of Vincenza Di Carlo, wife of Mafia boss Giuseppe Di Carlo. By the year's end, Angelo had secured his place as Di Carlo's underboss, forging alliances through covert meetings in the Di Carlo residence. Police noted their contrasting styles. Di Carlo was methodical and diplomatic, while Angelo's methods were steeped in violence. Angelo earned the moniker Buffalo Bill not for his appearance, but for his ruthlessness. His reputation grew after a 1915 assault on a police officer, which cost him a $250 fine. His actions cemented his fearsome image in Buffalo's criminal circles, where his name inspired both respect and dread. Angelo's ascent was interrupted by tragedy in January 1916. His wife Rosaria succumbed to influenza and pneumonia at just 29, leaving Angelo a widower with an infant daughter. Unable to care for the child, he sent her to live with Rosaria's relatives in New York City. Consumed by grief, Angelo left Buffalo for Niagara Falls, where he opened a cigar shop that covertly operated as a gambling hub. Business prospered, but his personal life was marked by isolation and loss. The onset of Prohibition in 1920 presented Angelo with new opportunities. Teaming up with his brother Paul, Angelo built a bootlegging empire, smuggling alcohol from Canada into western New York. The Palmieris collaborated with Canadian crime lord Rocco Perry, extending their operations from Buffalo to Cleveland. The illicit liquor trade brought immense wealth, but also dangerous enemies. In 1921, Emilio Gnazzo, a gambler who failed to repay a loan, was found dead, a bullet lodged in his skull. The sole witness, Gnazzo's wife, accused Angelo of the murder, but when the trial began, she had vanished. The case crumbled and Angelo walked free, his untouchable status reaffirmed but his list of adversaries growing. The Castellamarese War of 1930 divided the Mafia into violent factions. Angelo aligned with Salvatore Maranzano against Giuseppe Masseria, known as the Boss of Bosses. Angelo's home in Niagara Falls became a command center for Maranzano's faction, hosting figures like Joseph Bonanno. The war's brutality claimed the lives of Angelo's allies, including Filippo Mazzara, who was gunned down in Buffalo, and Giuseppe Di Benedetto, killed in a calculated ambush. Angelo's allegiance to Maranzano secured his survival, but the war took its toll. As the conflict subsided, Angelo's health began to fail, a stark contrast to the empire he once commanded. On December 21st, 1932, Angelo Palmieri died in his car, alone in his driveway. A stroke ended his life abruptly, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. The man who had inspired fear and respect met a quiet end, his legacy etched into the criminal history of Buffalo. Thousands attended Angelo's funeral, celebrating his generosity to the poor and his loyalty to his community. Yet behind the solemn ceremonies, the underworld buzzed with new plots and power struggles. For in the Mafia, even death was merely another turn in the endless game of dominance. When you think of Mafia bosses, images of flashy suits, roaring Cadillacs, and brutal displays of power often come to mind. But Nick Licata, the quiet and calculating boss of the Los Angeles crime family, shattered that stereotype. Operating from the shadows, this unassuming man wielded influence like a puppeteer, pulling strings with subtlety and precision. Licata wasn't the kind of boss to flaunt his power. He let his actions speak, whether it was orchestrating alibis for assassins or holding his ground against incursions from rival families. But behind his stoic exterior lay a man who watched his criminal dynasty crumble under relentless law enforcement pressure and internal betrayal. Stay tuned as we unravel the chilling story of Nick Licata, a man who proved that in the Mafia silence can be deadlier than gunfire. Nick Licata was born on February 20th, 1897 in Camporeale, a small Sicilian town near Palermo. His early life was shaped by the rigid codes of the honored society, the Sicilian Mafia, which controlled every aspect of life in the region. At 16, Licata left Sicily, sailing to the United States with $25 in his pocket. By 1929, after establishing himself in Detroit as a bootlegger, a conflict with local mob boss Joseph Zerilli forced Licata to flee westward. In Los Angeles, he found protection under the watchful eye of Jack Dragna, who brokered a truce with Zerilli and integrated Licata into the LA crime family. Licata's loyalty and discretion quickly earned him a place in Dragna's inner circle. In 1951, his allegiance was tested when Anthony Brancato and Anthony Trombino, two Kansas City mobsters seeking to expand into Los Angeles rackets, were found dead in a car riddled with bullets. Their murders were a message. The LA territory was not open for business. Licata's role in the aftermath was crucial. He hosted a gathering at his 5 o'clock cafe in Burbank, crafting an alibi for Aladena Jimmy the Weasel Fratiano, widely suspected of carrying out the killings. Witnesses testified to Fratiano's presence at the cafe all night, and the case against him crumbled. The public narrative of a convivial fish fry masked the violent reality of mob enforcement, an arrangement Licata orchestrated with cold precision. By 1967, Licata had risen to lead the Los Angeles crime family following the death of Frank DeSimone. His ascent came at a time of turmoil. The family's influence had been steadily eroded by law enforcement and internal divisions. Unlike his predecessors, Licata did not project power through ostentation. He operated quietly, managing rackets in gambling, loan sharking, and extortion from behind the scenes. However, challenges to his authority were constant. The Cleveland Mafia made inroads into his territory, culminating in the 1969 murder of Julius Anthony Petro, a Cleveland mobster with a history of bank robbery and suspected contract killings. Petro's body was discovered slumped in a car parked at Los Angeles International Airport, a single gunshot wound to the head marking his execution. The investigation into Petro's death brought Licata before a federal grand jury. He invoked omerta, refusing to answer questions despite being granted immunity. and was sentenced to 6 months for contempt of court. Licata's tenure as boss was marked by a steady erosion of power. Federal and local law enforcement intensified their scrutiny of the Los Angeles crime family, targeting its operations and members with relentless pressure. Licata, once a figure of quiet control, found himself increasingly isolated. The death of his underboss, Joseph DiPolito, in 1974 further destabilized the organization, leaving Licata unable to consolidate his authority over the fractious family. The once cohesive network splintered, with factions forming under rival leaders. The son of former boss Jack Dragner began asserting control over parts of the family, diminishing Licata's influence. His health also began to fail, and by the time of his death on October 19, 1974, at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, the Los Angeles crime family was a shadow of its former self. Nick Licata was laid to rest at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City after a modest funeral attended by approximately 150 mourners. His leadership had been pragmatic, focused on preserving what power remained rather than seeking to expand the family's influence. The legacy he left behind was one of survival but also decline, a reflection of the challenges facing organized crime in an era of increasing law enforcement scrutiny. While Licata may not have been a visionary leader, his ability to maintain the Los Angeles crime family during a period of upheaval speaks to his resourcefulness. Yet his tenure was ultimately defined by a slow disintegration of the power and cohesion that once characterized the organization.